1915-1918. An attempt that was thwarted, and thanks to vigilance and to friendship of numerous friends of Armenian community, this resolution did not pass. The obstruction to the ever-growing international genocide recognition campaign by Turkey is on the rise, but is increasingly desperate, as Armenians around the globe mobilize and scale up their efforts to score tangible gains in their struggle for justice ahead of centennial of Armenian genocide in 2015. We should be aware of this growing obstruction and yet remain consolidated and resolute. Today I would like to pay tribute to Armenian American community of the West Coast US for their global leadership, which is increasingly a source of inspiration for those seeking the truth, but also a source of unbridled hate for those who fear progress. On behalf of the government of Armenia, I would like to also thank elected US officials at various levels, the California State Senate and Assembly, cities of Glendale, Pasadena, Burbank, San Francisco, Fresno, Montebello, and of course, Los Angeles. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your compassion and solidarity with our people. For their solidarity, they invariably extend to their Armenian American constituents and their friendship with the Republic of Armenia. Just yesterday, on the eve of Armenian Genocide Commemoration, I personally witnessed a historic experience in the county of Fresno, when the Board of Supervisors of this very important region of California unanimously voted to recognize the independence of the Republic of Artsakh. Thanks for exhibiting that flag here. And symbolically, yet powerfully, addressing one of the consequences of genocide committed against Armenian people between 1915 and 1923. I wholeheartedly thank the supervisors of County of Fresno and their leadership, and I congratulate all of us on this important milestone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilor Hovhannisyan. I'd like to now invite an individual up to the stage who is an exemplary member of our community, somebody who many of us take example from. He's an intellectual, a scholar, somebody who is a familiar face to many of you, and he is also the publisher of a newspaper, the California Courier. At this time, I would like to invite to the stage Mr. Harut Sasunyan.
Honored clergy, elected officials, and distinguished guests. This morning, President Obama once again issued a statement full of verbal gymnastics and shameful word games, adding fuel to the fire, adding insult to injury, and conspiring with the denialist regime in Turkey to downgrade our cause. However, the Armenians worldwide refuse to be sidetracked by such shameful games. We refuse to have our cause obstructed by such lies and denials. That is why today the United Armenian Council has proudly invited all the way from London a very distinguished international jurist who's on the front lines of our cause in bringing our demands to the international courts and international community, and not simply getting sidetracked by these denials, by these words of massacre, tragedy, etc. We have with us Mr. Jeffrey Robertson. He has a very distinguished and long record, but I will make it brief, otherwise I'll run the risk of making the introduction longer than his keynote speech. He's a founder and joint head of Doughty Street Chambers, the largest law firm on human rights in London. He's had a distinguished career as a trial and appellate counsel, an international judge, and author of several legal textbooks. He served as a UN appeal judge and first president of the UN War Crimes Court in Sierra Leone. He's the author of the leading textbook on international criminal law titled Crimes Against Humanity, The Struggle for Global Justice. Not surprisingly, the book contains extensive references to the Armenian genocide. He has also written the authoritative legal analysis which proves that Turkey committed genocide as it is defined in international law, and he has shown how the UK's recent refusal to confirm this fact stems from its fears of Turkish economic reprisals. He has authored the magisterial document filed in the European Court of Human Rights, which sets Nagorno-Karabakh's or Artsak's claim to independent statehood. Even though he hails from London, but he is a native of Sydney, Australia, where he was born. He received his BA from Sydney University and LLB in honors in 1970. He attended Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar along with President Clinton in 1972. He has honorary doctorates in laws from Sydney, Brunel, and Bucharest universities. He's a Queen's Counsel as of 1988, a judge in England for the past 17 years. He's an appeal judge at UN War Crimes Court from 2002 and 2007, and more importantly, court president from 2002 to 2004. He's a distinguished jurist member of the Internal Justice Council of United Nations from 2008 to 2012. He received the New York Bar Association's Award for Achievement in International Law and Policy in 2011. From 1990 to present, he's the founder and head of the Doughty Street Chambers. He has served as counsel in over 200 cases in administrative, international, criminal, and public law in High Court and Court of Appeal, the House of Lords, and the UK Supreme Court, as well as the High Courts of Singapore, Malaysia, Antigua, Trinidad and Tobago, Anguilla, and final Court of Appeal in Hong Kong. He also served on cases in the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and World Bank Arbitration Court. He's currently acting for the government of Mauritius and for Armenia in European Court of Human Rights. Mr. Robertson has been a keynote speaker in many international conventions. He's a Master of the Middle Temple and a visiting professor in human rights at the University of London, Queen Mary College, and the New College of the Humanities. He lives in London with his wife and 2 college-age children. And to sum up, Mr. Robertson is a champion of justice and the truth, which makes him a great champion of the Armenian cause. Mr. Robertson, please.
It is a mighty honor, ladies and gentlemen, to address you today. A day of overwhelming sadness, as you recall the 2 million of your people driven into the wilderness by the wicked Turkish government of the time. We remember their sufferings as they were starved and raped and murdered, as that government knew they would be starved and raped and murdered, and we mourn for those martyrs of that time. But by commemorating them, we resolve not only to make them martyrs, but to ensure that the cause that they were martyred for will eventually triumph. Because this is not just a question, is it, of sorrow and sadness all that time ago. The attempt to exterminate a race, because that is what it was, is not just unforgettable 98 years later. It is unforgivable unless and until the perpetrators, the state of Turkey, makes amends. Because so this shouldn't just be a day of sadness. It should be a day first of anger, a righteous anger, and then a day to demand justice. I want in this address to you today to explain why Armenians deserve justice, first in relation to the Turkish government for what was legally genocide, and secondly against the Azerbaijan government for their new threats of genocide against the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. And I want to explain how the government of the United States can help in both cases. Now, I'm not a historian, I'm a judge. I apply the law to evidence that is gathered by historians. And that's how I came first to study the Armenian genocide, when several of your people came to me in my chambers in London to ask my opinion. You see, back in 1915, it was the British who had been the first to denounce the massacres by the Turks in 1915. And you know what they called it, what they got France and Russia, as well as Britain, to call it at a conference in 1915, the first time the phrase had ever been heard in the world. They called it a crime against humanity. And they promised that the perpetrators would be punished. Winston Churchill, the great British leader, then called it a crime without a name. And the British, you know, were as good as their word. They rounded up 67 Turkish officials, took them to Malta to try them for this crime against humanity. But it was a crime not only without a name, it turned out to be a crime without a law, because they found out from the evidence they gathered, and we're talking about 1919 when the evidence was fresh, they found that these Turkish officials who'd been responsible for rounding up Armenians and sending them into the desert, for killing the men and for sending the women and old men and children into the desert, had been officials. They'd been authorized by the government. And there was then no international criminal law that could convict government servants for obeying the law of the time. So those 69 officials had to be released. And only in 1933 did a brilliant legal professor called Raphael Lemkin find a solution. He found a name for the crime that Winston Churchill had said was a crime without a name. And the name he found in 1933 was genocide. And what in 1933 did Raphael Lemkin apply it to? In 1933, Hitler had barely started on his persecution against the Jews. That wasn't in question. No, Raphael Lemkin applied it to the Armenian massacres. That was the crime without a name that needed a name, that needed an international law against it. It was before Hitler started. Of course, Hitler got underway, and we all remember, it should be engraved, you know, on everyone's mind, what Hitler said on the borders of Poland as he was enthusing his troops to show no mercy to the Poles. He was encouraging them to kill the Polish intelligentsia, the Polish leadership, to show absolutely no mercy, because, said Hitler, who now remembers the Armenians? That was what Hitler said. Who now remembers the Armenians? Of course, no one did, except Raphael Lemkin, and he fought that lonely struggle. It wasn't till 1948 when a very brilliant, I'm proud to say, a brilliant Australian, Dr. H.V. Evatt, who was the chairman of the president of the General Assembly of the United Nations, understood what Lemkin was going on about and introduced, based on Lemkin's inspiration, the Genocide Convention, the day after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the Genocide Convention is very clear. It makes it an international crime, prosecutable anywhere, to destroy a national group. And you can do that, says the Genocide Convention, by killing part of them, or by this. And this was drafted just to take into account the Armenian genocide by deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or part. Now that was exactly what was done to the Armenians in 1915. They had inflicted upon them, all 2 million, conditions of life that were calculated to bring about their partial destruction, and it brought about the destruction of almost 3/4 of them. Now, there is no doubt at all that what happened was genocide. No doubt legally at all. So why does the UK government now, like the United States government, refuse to call it what it is, genocide? Well, said the UK government, the evidence isn't sufficiently unequivocal. There are historians who disagree. There was no order signed by Talent to exterminate the race. Well, of course, this is ridiculous. The evidence is overwhelming. It's not for historians to decide, it's for judges to decide, looking at the evidence. It said there was no order to exterminate. Ladies and gentlemen, there was no order from Hitler, was there, to exterminate the Jews? We never found an order to that effect. There was no order from the head of the Hutus in Rwanda to exterminate the Tutsis. Those genocides were done without an order. They're obvious inference from the historical facts. Well, why was the British government, like the American government, afraid to use the word genocide? What I did was to file a number of Freedom of Information Act requests to get at the truth behind this volte-face, why Britain was not saying what it said at the time. And what I discovered were all these memoranda to ministers from the Foreign Office saying the position we're taking is unethical. They actually admitted that. We're doing something unethical, but it's in our commercial, strategic, and political interest to pretend that it wasn't genocide, because the Turks are neuralgic. They use that word, neuralgic, utterly neurotic about it. Irrationally neurotic was what the British secretly concluded, and that they would get very angry and refuse the use of Turkey for strategic reasons and would cut off economic assistance. So I exposed this. I felt that Britain was actually, by making these bogus excuses for not saying it was genocide, to protect Turkey, a NATO member, from going crazy if he did, was hiding the truth. We know the history. It's there in the books. The massacres and pogroms of the 1890s, when the Ottoman Empire was called the sick man of Europe. That hideous burning to death of Armenians at Urfa Cathedral. Over 1,000 of them were burned to death, and that was 1898. It behoved the Turkish government to keep this down, but yet in the 1910, 1911, the Turkification program, Armenians were called by the official newspaper tubercular microbes. You get this kind of physical nastiness that is typical of the build-up to genocide. The CUP, the young Turkish organization, started to change the names of towns from Christian names to Muslim names. They passed laws that seized the assets of Armenians. If you had a bank account in Turkey at the time, you had it taken and moved to government funds. Liquidation commissions started to seize Turkish assets, just as 20 years later they did in the 1930s to the Jews. And then, of course, on April the 24th, 1915, the roundup of intellectual leaders in what was then Constantinople, it is now Istanbul. The first victims are always the poets, the writers, the lawyers, the intellectual leaders of the race that is to be exterminated. And then I have to say, of course, some of my relatives on April the 24th were offshore in troop ships because they were about to land at Gallipoli, and we Australians have April the 25th as our Anzac Day commemoration of all those who were killed by Turkish bullets. We've made peace with Turkey because it was, in a sense, not their fault. They were defending their homeland. But there can be no peace without justice, and that is the justice they've denied the Armenians. They used it as an excuse to round up the leaders and to begin the ethnic cleansing of Anatolia. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The great British historian Arnold Toynbee collected hundreds of statements in the Blue Books, testimony to how local government officials and police, obeying orders from central government, began the attack on the Christian Armenians. What is very, very important is the German diplomats and German missionaries. Germany was in league with Turkey. It was an ally of Turkey. And these people were so appalled at what their allies were doing in exterminating the Armenians, they wrote to Berlin about it. And their testimonies are in the files. This is very important evidence, overwhelming evidence from Turk's own allies. And then, of course, there were the Americans. In those days, the New York Times took photographs of those columns of men, old men and women and children, those tragic pictures of them beginning the death marches to the deserts. And there was Harold Morgenthau, we've heard of him already. He was the ambassador who actually went and spoke to people like Talat. And they told him, I quote, "Let us deal with these Christians as we please. We must bring the Armenian problem to an end in a final way, a final solution." That was the objective of the Young Turk government, to eliminate the race. And finally, there was a fact-finding commission sent out by the US government, led by Major General Harbord in 1919. And it collected overwhelming evidence about how the men in a particular town, in many towns, aged between 15 and 45, would be rounded up, taken away and killed, and the remainder would be the women, the old men and the young boys would be sent into the desert. There is